He's a renegade general with links to the CIA and a mission to save Libya. But Khalifa Haftar is accused by the army of staging a coup. It's a battle for power in Libya and it's only intensifying. This is Inside Story. Hello, I'm Kamal Santamaria. Almost 3 years now since its revolution, and Libya is a country awash with weapons and militias with competing agendas and affiliations. But it's all come to a head, or rather it's been brought to a head, by a former general heading up his self-declared Libyan National Army. His name is Khalifa Haftar, and forces loyal to him say they were behind an assault on Libya's parliament in the capital Tripoli on Sunday. An attack coupled with a demand that the General National Congress, the GNC, hand over its power. That's after Haftar had earlier vowed to rid Benghazi of what he called extremist groups and a terrorist scourge.
All
the forces are there and they are getting ready. In the military, when we launch a battle, it is followed by reorganizing our troops. Then we return with strength. It is impossible for us to go back on this matter. We will never retreat until we reach our goals.
And the result of that defiance is more and more violence, which threatens to further splinter Libya 3 years after the overthrow of Colonel Muammar Gaddafi.
The government condemns the expression of political opinion through the use of armed force from all parties, and it calls for an immediate end to the use of the military arsenal.
So where is all this taking Libya, and does Khalifa Haftar have enough of a movement behind him to actually unseat a parliament? Our discussion in a moment. First, an update from Omar al-Saleh in Tripoli.
The Libyan government insists that it is still controlling the capital, Tripoli, as well as Benghazi. It did send reinforcements from former rebel brigades to protect the outskirts of Tripoli, as well as different areas within the capital. And this also applies to the eastern city of Benghazi. Now, a source close to the head of the General National Congress gave orders to the forces that are called the Shield of Libya. That forces is made of former rebels. They are stationed in the center as well as western Libya. So you have a sense that the government is taking these incidents and the forces, the attacking forces who are loyal to retired General Khalifa Haftar, very seriously. Now, what this crisis highlights is the fact that Libya is very chaotic. The government is very weak. You have deep political divisions within the General National Congress, as well as the government is very weak. It lacks the military abilities to rein in powerful militia groups that are acting in impunity in Libya since the toppling of Colonel Gaddafi. Now, it depends on who you speak to. Some Libyans are really worried because they say this is the beginning of wider divisions that could lead Libya to civil war. Omar al-Saleh for Inside Story, Tripoli.
So will this latest revolt make worse the long, volatile divisions in Libya? Let's ask our guest with me here in Doha, Osama Kubbar, who's a political analyst at the Strategic Studies Center and former vice president of the Supreme Council of Libyan Revolutionaries. And over in Washington, D.C. is David Mack, former U.S. Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Near Eastern Affairs and a former U.S. ambassador himself. Gentlemen, we thank you for your time. I actually think at this point, very early point in the show, we should actually provide a little bit more of an introduction to Khalifa Haftar, because his life, his career have taken all sorts of twists and turns, and we need the viewers to understand this. Going way back to 1969 first, the retired general backed Muammar Gaddafi in the coup that brought the late Libyan leader to power. But then the two men fell out. This was following a disastrous Libyan campaign in Chad in 1987. Haftar later defected to the United States, where he's been living for the past 2 decades. And it's during this period in exile he is rumoured to have links with the CIA. Haftar returned to Libya in 2011. He joined the uprising against Muammar Gaddafi. Remember, this is the man who he helped bring to power. He's now effectively turned against him. But in February of this year, Haftar appeared on television calling for a caretaker government to end Libya's political crisis. Some saw that as the beginnings of Haftar orchestrating a coup. So that tells us a little bit more about the man himself. Osama, if I can start with you here in the studio. Thank you for joining us, first of all.
My pleasure.
So short story is that he fell out with Gaddafi and then he came back to Libya as part of the revolution. But I've read also that he was always treated with a little bit of suspicion when he rejoined when he joined the revolution. So is that the case, or was it?
Absolutely. Libyan didn't forget that Haftar basically was the commander of the Libyan journey in Chad, and he defected and left behind the troops in Jazeera. So he was really the main culprit for the failure of the Libyan army in Chad, and he really bear the blood and the death of thousands of Libyans there. This is a history, and Libyans would not really forget this. As a person who was really close to Gaddafi, and we know Gaddafi is very devilish, and he always keeps ties with his people. Haftar joined the opposition party when he went to the United States, which is the Libyan National Front. And
so it might be fair enough to think that he'd changed. I mean, he'd fallen out with Gaddafi. He went for 20 years. He joined an opposition group. Then he came to Libya to join the revolution. You could understand why he'd do that.
Absolutely. But the suspicious will always, or the suspicion will be there. Okay. Also for Mr. Zidane, by the way, for Ali Zidane, it is really documented that the Libyan National Front were really suspicious that he was double agent. Okay. So the same thing goes for Haftar. When Haftar joined the uprising against Gaddafi, he was always treated with suspicious, and he was not really in any role. So Haftar was never been in charge during the revolution. He didn't really play a major role during the revolution. Even the month after the revolution, he was not really effective. He was really kicked out from Benghazi. He went to Tripoli. He was not really received properly in Tripoli. And I tell you this for sure. He went and stayed in Zawiya, and I'm from Zawiya. He went and stayed for Zawiya for 3 months, staying in a small hotel in the Zawiyan refinery. These are the facts and events, and he cannot really deny that.
Okay, let's add another piece to the puzzle, and we'll do that with David Mack in Washington. Good to have you with us, Ambassador. He's an interesting character, definitely, from all the descriptions we just heard there from Osama. His time in the US, 20 years there, and then all this talk about links with the CIA. Can you explain a little more for our viewers about that?
Well, it's natural that people would have suspicions about the ties between the U.S. government and Khalifa Haftar. But I would hasten to note that the events that we're talking about took place 2-3 decades ago. That was a time when the United States was involved in very aggressive programs against the Gaddafi government. We bombed Tripoli, we bombed Benghazi. That we would have had connections with Khalifa Haftar at that time should not be surprising to anybody. But that those connections should have survived into some kind of role for Haftar as an American agent in the current events in Libya, that's totally in the realm of supposition and guesswork. And it is not anything you want to rely upon. And I really agree with Osama Kubbar that this is a very chaotic situation right now, that it would be wrong to place too much credibility on statements that are made that sound very authoritative. When you have a general commenting on events in the country, you sort of imagine that he commands a large number of military units and troops. But in fact, the Libyan military was almost completely devastated by Gaddafi, who maintained control just through some very close personal units tied to him personally. And the Libyan military is not in a position to take command of the country in the way that you might assume, say, in Egypt with the Egyptian military. So this should not be viewed as a simple clash between the Libyan military and Islamist politicians and militias on the other hand.
Well, this is, if you just say that for a moment, this is exactly what Osama and I were talking about just before the show. The fact that, again, that idea of links with the CIA had been blown out a little bit, and then this idea of problems with Islamist elements in the parliament. Again, it's an argument thrown around that this is what Khalifa Haftar, well, this is his problem.
Yeah, but this is just for really buying people's view or getting people's support. Yeah. Because especially in Benghazi, like I can tell you, and they are really, they have a point here where people are really sick of what's really happening in Benghazi, and they're really sick of that the government and the parliament didn't really do anything for the amount of killing that's happening and the amount of bombing and the lack of security in Benghazi. People are being killed every day, 3 or 4 people every day in Benghazi, yet the parliament and the government didn't even stretch a hand of help and emotional support to Benghazi. So the regular citizens in Benghazi, they just want to see any kind of help or any person who can step in and say, I can do something. A person like Haftar, who has some international backing, and I certainly agree with Mr. David here when he said that Haftar does not really have at least the major forces, international forces backing him. I can tell you for sure that as we speak, or actually from yesterday, there's an international movement for supporting the legitimacy in Libya and denouncing all the other activity and actions coming out from Haftar or from any other brigades that want to really cause problems in Libya.
And you've said the word legitimacy, and this is perhaps important. Let me start again with David Mack on this one. Legitimacy of the government is a concern here because by the numbers and by the dates, this government or this parliament is not legitimate. It was supposed to run out in February, and it has, you know, this talk of, well, what Khalifa Haftar was is to hand over to some sort of caretaker government. This current parliament is not legitimate, technically speaking.
Well, that's one way of looking at it. The other way of looking at it is that it is the only elected group that can claim that it has come to some kind of position of responsibility in that way. It has not been very successful in securing the country, as Osama Kubbar said, but it does have a certain legitimacy in the Libyan context, where you would have to compare it with, say, these militias that have sprung up that may have a certain amount of support in their hometown, for example, or home region or tribe, but don't have any kind of national expression. The things to remember are that we recently had a meeting of the Friends of Libya, the international community. That's United Nations, European Union, the governments of the UAE and Qatar. They recently met in Rome. They agreed to support this process of democratization, which I would call Libyan institutions trying to struggle to their feet after a long period of dictatorship. And they're going to support that. You saw a very concrete expression of the support when the United States government intercepted a ship near Cyprus, which had loaded up on oil illegally from one of the terminals that had been captured by a local force. This is an indication of the fact that the international community does support central institutions, while recognizing that those institutions are very weak and haven't really been able to do all the things that are expected of them. But, for example, there are measures underway to train a Libyan special purpose group. The United States, United Kingdom, Italy, Turkey are all involved in doing this. There also are special envoys who've been working with different Libyan factions trying to attain some kind of consensus on a constitution. There has been an elected 60-member constitutional convention meeting in El Beida under the supervision of a former Libyan minister, Ali Tarhouni, that's trying to come up with the draft of a constitution. There is also a consensus building process conducted by Fadl Lamine, I think probably in Tripoli now. So there are these efforts to come up with institutions that would be both more representative and would ultimately be able to conduct the practical affairs of the country. But we're just not there yet.
Right. Gentlemen, I'm pleased to say we've got another guest joining us. Jason Pack is with us from Cambridge in the UK. He's the president of libyaanalysis.com. So thank you for joining us, and I'd like to throw a few questions your way. Hopefully you could hear what we were discussing there. And I guess the biggest point David Mack was making, this idea of weak institutions. And I guess in the long run, this is what gives rise to someone like Khalifa Haftar, when you have got all these institutions which can't get anything done, and someone like Khalifa Haftar and his group decide, well, we need to take things into our own hands.
I think that analysis is correct. There's an institutional vacuum in Libya, and this void is trying to be filled by various charismatic leaders. Haftar is one among 2 or 3 others. However, I would like to point out that I don't see what's developing in Libya as chaotic at all. It's developments that have been happening since February played to their logical conclusion. What do I mean by that? There has been an increasing ossification of the major political forces of the country into 2 groups. The one group are the anti-Islamists, the Zintanis in the Nafusa Mountains and their militia, Haftar, for example, and some liberal technocrats, and then the other group, which are those kind of Muslim Brotherhood, pro-Islamist militias, Misratan militias, as well as some jihadists in the east. So what's going on is that there's a struggle, not a civil war, but a struggle between these groups in Benghazi, and just at the moment that some of the anti-Islamist groups led by the Saika Brigade, as well as by Khalifa Haftar's forces in the east, were about to make a breakthrough. The GNC, which is the elected Congress body, but is dominated by Islamist groups, has sided against the people, against the Libyan people, and with some of these more extremist Islamists, telling those who are fighting the Islamists in Benghazi to back down. And therefore, what has happened in Tripoli over the last few days, it's not a coup, and I don't even believe it's directed by Haftar. It's directed by some Zintani brigades, particularly the Sawa'iq and Kaka brigades, who are trying to exploit the situation to throw out the GNC and install an anti-Islamist grouping.
Okay.
And that's a natural phenomenon and struggle.
Jason, I'll get a view from Osama Kubbar in just a moment, but I want to pick up on something you said. I mean, you've talked about these extremes on the spectrum, but isn't the fact that we're actually dealing with hundreds of militias here, all of varying strengths, of varying views, of varying allegiances, and that's the huge problem. It's not just extremes, it's complete splintering.
I think that in 2012 and 2013 it was relevant that there were hundreds of militias pulling the country in 2 or 3 different ways, but since February of this year, as the GNC overstayed its mandate, you really see 2 primary cleavages backing up. And those who want the GNC to continue, which is the Misratans and some Islamist groups, and Islamists of every variety, from moderate to Muslim Brotherhood to more Salafist to extreme to the Martyrs Bloc, and then this other group of the Zintanis and the liberal technocrats and Haftar, who are on the other side. So rather than a splintering, we're getting into a polarization into 2 groups, and one can only hope that they can have some kind of grand bargain and use the institutions that David Mack mentioned, like the national dialogue and the constitutional process, as a way to bridge the gap between these 2 forces, because fighting it out in a kind of civil war scenario is not only an awful solution, but it isn't going to happen, and it's not going to be in the best interest of Libyans.
Osama, Jason has said that it is polarizing, or polarization, not splintering.
Absolutely. Actually, his Jason analysis is really perfect. Like since the February 7, 2014, yes, all the people who really fought bravely to overthrow Gaddafi, they got together and they are supporting the legitimacy in the country. The other factions that Mr. Jason just stated, absolutely they're against that. And as I explained to you before we started the show, they don't want to go with the common sense. They're saying February 7th, the parliament is concluded, and that's it, and just throw the country into chaos.
You're saying the common sense is to extend the
absolutely the common sense, like the parliament when finished February 7th, whom they are going to hand to.
Yeah.
Okay. So
well, here's an idea: elections.
Well, absolutely. Actually, the current parliament, they draw a roadmap for 2 months roadmap until they execute a new election for a parliament to replace them. Yet the other section that Mr. Jason spoke about, they are refusing this. They are really putting all the barriers to prevent another election because they wanted really to hand in the responsibility to a tribal body. Okay, and this is completely wrong because this tribal body is not really not elected, and the majority of these people were really the men of Gaddafi. Yeah. So this is where we're really having a major conflict. We, the people who fought and fought bravely to overtake, to overthrow Gaddafi, we wanted to maintain the legitimacy that we elected through the regular democratic way.
Well, let me ask David Mack about that there. I know I was being a little bit tongue-in-cheek, a little bit simplistic by just suggesting elections because Libya is a young democracy, but that would be the way forward, wouldn't it? I mean, if you're worried about legitimacy of bodies, then you've got to be electing them.
Well, eventually that's going to have to be true, but it ought to be done, if possible, in a constitutional framework. The United Nations, however, does stand ready to step in and provide the kind of technical assistance to the Libyans that it did in the past. We know from the record that as many problems as Libya has had in the last 3 years, and I don't underestimate them, nonetheless, it has been able to conduct, Libyans have been able to conduct peaceful elections with technical support from the United Nations, and I think they can do it again. But the timing ought to be probably decided through consensus and based on the idea of having it as part of a constitutional system.
Jason, did you want to say something there?
I sure did. I wanted to back up and say that this attempt by groups, as Osama pointed out, to claim sole legitimacy as we are the ones who made the revolution, as many in the GNC do and many Misratan militias do. We are the ones who made the revolutions. Guys like Khalifa Haftar, Gaddafi agents. This is, of course, over the top and not accurate. There may have been some people who had in the time, in the 1980s or 70s, worked with Gaddafi, but then they had 20 or 30 solid years of being in the opposition, and to try to kick them out and say, because of the political isolation law, they can't participate, is this zero-sum logic that has made things become, in my terms, so polarized. And what we need is a kind of national reconciliation along the South African model. I would agree that Haftar does not have much support in Libya today, as do many others who were at one time working for Gaddafi and then had joined the opposition. But these Zintani militias certainly do have an important element of support. And the populace in Libya, if you could stage a poll, they wouldn't vote in the Muslim Brotherhood. They'd vote in one of these anti-Islamist parties. And when you go around Libya, they talk about wanting to have a Sisi who would govern them, as scary as that might seem. So you need to get a sense of the lay of the land in terms of the different people and realize that everyone needs to have their voice. And what we need is a grand bargain between all the stakeholders, even potentially the federalist stakeholders, but certainly all the anti-federalist stakeholders, meaning Jason, Misrata, Zintan, the Brotherhood, to move forward.
Let me jump in because we've only got a couple of minutes left. I want to get a few final thoughts from all of you. Start with you, Osama.
Yeah, I think the statement that the Libyans they're saying that we need a Sisi to run the country. This is really a false statement. There are some really some people that are saying this, but the vast majority they are really rejecting this, and the vast majority are really against Haftar, against the movement of Zintan, what they did in Tripoli, and also they want to go with the election process.
Right. So very quickly, and I'm going to ask all three of you this. I'll start with you, Osama. How do you actually see this playing out right now? What's going on with Khalifa Haftar and his forces?
Khalifa Haftar, actually, he doesn't really have that much support. There are very few fractions that really supporting him. Even within the Libyan army, he has really zero support. He has nothing to do. He was kicked out of Benghazi badly. Okay, and he cannot really show up in public.
Jason, really quickly, you've said that you don't even think this is a coup.
I would agree with what Osama said. Haftar has little support, but I would disagree by pointing out that the anti-Islamist forces, if there was an election, would clearly win. And that's why certain members of the GNC have tried to rig the process and prevent a direct presidential election. The problem is that there's no agreed-upon rules of the game. People can't even agree who the prime minister is. Is it Ahmed Matig? Is it Afini? And this is where you need to go back to basic principles, have some kind of grand bargain so that the Libyan people can say, this is what constitutes legitimacy. Right. This is the constitutional process. Even if I disagree with you, we're going to fight within the rules that we've agreed upon. And sadly, Libya is lacking that at the moment, and it's a free-for-all. And this is the logical conclusion of the processes that we've seen over the past months. It has to be corrected because Libyans don't want to be killing each other.
And David Mack, a final thought from you. Where do you see this current situation going?
Well, I think that one of the very hopeful things is that the international community, United Nations, European Union, other friends of Libya, including Arab states, very much supports a consensus-building process that will lead to new constitutionally endorsed elections and a government that can actually begin restoring Libya's central institutions for the benefit of all the Libyan people.
David Mack, Jason Pack, Osama Kubbar, we thank you all so much for joining us today. Thank you.
Thank you, gentlemen.
And we thank you, of course, for joining us wherever you are around the world. Please add your voice to this discussion, won't you? You can find us on Facebook. We're at facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can send your comments as well on Twitter at AJ Inside Story is our handle there. I'm Kamal Santamaria from the whole team. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you again soon.